Uh, Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Sheryll Cashin, who's the author of Place, Not Race, A New Vision of Opportunity in America. She's currently a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Professor Cashin teaches constitutional law and race and American law, among other subjects, and writes about race relations and inequality in America, really small topics. Her earlier book, The Failures of Integration, was an editor's choice in the New York Times Book Review. And she's also a two-time nominee for the Hudson Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction in 2005 and 2009. She's published widely in academic journals and trade media and is a frequent commentator on race relations on radio, television, and online media. She's also an op-ed contributor for the New York Times, and her recent article, Justice for Blacks and Whites, as the Civil Rights Act turns 50, Creating a Cross-Racial Allegiance, marks the Civil Rights 50th anniversary. Professor Cashin worked in the Clinton White House as an advisor on urban and economic policy and is an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and Building One America, which is an emerging national network of state and regional coalitions promoting sustainable growth and inclusion. She also served as a law clerk to the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Judge Abner Mivka of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Today she's going to speak about her latest book, Place, Not Race, and discuss its implications for affirmative action in the United States, which is an ongoing, seemingly never resolved issue. I give you Professor Cashin.
Thank you so much, Marta. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and thank you so much to everyone for coming this afternoon. It's a real honor to be here. I want to talk for not too long about opportunity and a phenomenon I will describe called opportunity hoarding. And I'd like to begin with my personal story. I, in some ways, feel grateful to be middle-aged. I graduated from high school in 1980 at the high water mark for school integration in the South. I graduated from S.R. Butler High School in Huntsville, Alabama, which was, at that time, a well-integrated public high school that was enabled me, the child of broke activist parents, to get a pretty good education. I was the co-valedictorian of the school, and I actually got into and accepted to my dream school, which was Princeton University at the time. However, if you can believe it or not, it sounds quaint now. I mean, Princeton offered me a financial aid package with some aid and $4,000 in student loans, and that $4,000 terrified me. And you can think, how's that? You know, but if you're living with a family that has an annual income of $17,000 a year, $4,000 is a lot of money. And so I had also applied to Vanderbilt, which was up the road from Huntsville, and Vanderbilt offered me a 4-year scholarship, and that got my attention, and Vanderbilt became the school of my dreams, and I went there. But today, a valedictorian from the same high school, Butler High School, would not likely get much notice from any elite institution. Why? Because Butler and the neighborhood that surrounds it has gone from being integrated and middle class to heavily black and poor. And in fact, only 42% of all Americans now live in a middle-class neighborhood, and that's down from 65% in 1970. Why is that? It's because of the increasing separation of the affluent and the highly educated from everyone else. And where one lives, place often determines who has access to high-quality K-12 education, which in turn determines heavily who has access to selective higher education. And I set out to illuminate that phenomenon in this book. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to disrobe. I'm a little warm. I'm sorry about that. That's better. And I'm going to begin with a visual to show that. My friend in the back was going to cue up. Okay. All right. Can you see this? It's a map that shows color-coded. It goes from the least number, the pale areas have the lowest number of college graduates. The darkest area has 40% or more, 40% or more of the population has college graduates. And actually, college graduates used to be much more evenly distributed. Actually, we have 3,000 counties in the United States of America, which are reflected on this map. Only 17 counties in the entire United States have a population with 50% or more of the population having college degrees. And you could probably guess what some of these counties are. Marin County, north of San Francisco, some of the affluent suburbs right outside of Washington, D.C., where I live. This part of the country where Princeton is located is a little unusual, a high density of college graduates. But as I said, college graduates used to be much more evenly distributed. In fact, the segregation between high school graduates and college graduates has nearly tripled since 1940. And highly educated people, they're drawn to metro centers, but even within metro centers, within cities and towns, they're drawn to neighborhoods of their own kind. And this is a phenomenon that transcends race. College graduates living in America's most highly educated metro regions are more residentially isolated than African Americans. And this concentration of human capital in some places and not others has consequences for children. Some children, like mine, I'm blessed to be the mother of twin 7-year-olds, the best thing that ever happened to me. But some kids like mine grow up in environments chock full of doctors, lawyers, World Bank economists, prize-winning journalists. I mean, the list goes on, and the networks are deep. And it's a metaphor that a friend of mine, John Powell, who works on a lot of these issues, likens it to riding the up escalator. If you just live in these neighborhoods with this dense concentration of highly educated people, college knowledge is just in the ether, right? The habits of success are in the ether. You just pick it up by being there. But living in low opportunity neighborhoods, it's almost the opposite. In fact, there's research that shows that if you live in a low opportunity neighborhood, it almost guarantees downward mobility. And anybody who can buy their way into a high opportunity neighborhood is automatically guaranteed access to highly selective K through 12 education that sets them up very well to enter elite higher education. And I'm reminded of this quote from a person who's a dean of a prestigious law school, and she said this in a meeting one day, and it really struck me. She said, "Those that are afforded highly selective K through 12 education enter elite colleges and become leaders, and everybody else gets to watch it on television." And that's increasingly what we have in this society. Now I'll zoom in on, since we're in New Jersey, let's see. I'm going to zoom in on New Jersey. New Jersey's probably not a good example because it's fairly dense. But I should say, I shouldn't skip dear old Alabama. I'll show you where I'm from, right? I come from Huntsville, Alabama, Madison County, Rocket City. We put I was surrounded by literally rocket scientists who helped put built the boosters that put the man on the moon, and I have a degree in electrical engineering in part because I was influenced by that. But there's not one county in my state, that's dark red. Now I'm going to add some complexity. I'm going to add, let's go to the second slide. Is he not there? Oh, I need to do it? Okay, sorry. I have a degree in electrical engineering, but this stuff terrifies me. Okay. It's the reason I went to law school. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay. I did it. Okay. I got Connecticut, which is not far, right? And the reason I chose Connecticut is just because this map was available to me. This is a map that was commissioned by the Connecticut Fair Housing Authority. The Kirwan Institute at Ohio State put it together. But let me just tell you what you're seeing. They mapped the state by educational opportunity. The darkest areas of the state, I'll zoom it in a little bit for you. The darkest areas of the state are the high opportunity areas, and the palest areas are the lowest opportunity areas. And those little green dots, any little green dot you see on there is 500 non-white people. Now, zoom it back. You see where all the green dots are, don't you? Okay, and you're not surprised, right? Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport. You see these concentrations of non-white people in pale districts. And like I said only 42% of America, and let me, before I talk a little bit further about this map, I want to make it clear how they decided what was high opportunity and what was low or medium opportunity. They used data in terms of the population, the percentage of the population with college degrees, the student poverty rate, test scores for math and reading, the student-teacher ratio, and most importantly to me, teacher qualifications, the percentage of highly qualified teachers. So a high opportunity area has highly qualified teachers and a lot of people with college degrees and great outcomes in math and scores. And low opportunity areas, the palest areas, have the weakest teachers. There's a lawsuit going on, and this is Connecticut, but I don't care what your state is. I don't care what your state is. Maybe some of these good government states like Massachusetts are a little bit better, but you will see these same patterns of segregation. Now, I said that only 42% of all Americans live in a middle-class neighborhood today. Well, for Black and Latino children, it's much worse. Only about 30% of Black and Latino children live in a middle-class neighborhood. I'm going to repeat that. Only about 30% of Black and Latino children live in a middle-class neighborhood, and I'm not going to sugarcoat what that means. That means they have fewer access to peers who model habits of success. Often they're in crappy, separate and equal schools that will make you angry or make you cry when you go into them. The lawsuit I mentioned, there's this lawsuit that's gotten a lot of attention out of Los Angeles where they sued the teachers' unions. They sued about tenure standards. Well, the weakest teachers often get fired from the high-quality districts. There are some school districts in Los Angeles or some schools in low-poverty areas where 90% of the teachers are teachers that were fired from other places because they were perceived as not being good enough, and they become dumping grounds for places. But also beyond schools, it may, in these high-poverty areas, you may have fewer grocery stores, fewer parks, you may have to negotiate violence. This is the kind of stuff that a lot of Black and Latino kids in public school have to face. Meanwhile, the average existence for a white or an Asian child today is exactly the opposite. On average, the white and Latino kids are in neighborhoods where it's 0 to 14% poverty. But that said, the reason I'm attracted to place rather than race is that place captures complexity. Not all white people are privileged, not all Asian people are privileged, and not all black and Latino kids are poor. You notice there's some pale areas, particularly, let me move it back a little bit. There's some pale areas where there are no non-white people to be found, right? These are poor white folks, struggling white folks in low opportunity settings that don't have a lot of non-white people in there, right? Place captures this complexity. While with each passing decade, as bad as this map may look in terms of racial segregation, with each passing decade, we get slow glacial improvement for racial segregation, at least between blacks and whites. It's actually increasing for Latinos. But we've had this tremendous spike since 1970 in terms of economic segregation. And economic segregation is rising fastest among blacks and Latinos. Black 1%ers, Latino 1%ers, they aren't living in Hartford, in Bridgeport. They're moving to places like West Hartford, high opportunity, right? People, the 1%ers who have choice and options, are moving to high opportunity settings, right? Why wouldn't they, right? Where do you think places like Princeton get their blacks and Latinos, right? I mean, these are hard questions to deal with. And by the way, this is, you know, not the most comfortable thing to talk about, but immigrants with black skin tend to live in more integrated settings, right? Black Americans, natives, for lack of a better word, I got that word from Douglas Massey, right? They're the ones who tend to suffer the segregation, right? So we're very, very complicated, and I think place captures the complexity. Now, I want to get a sense for what time I should stop talking to take Q&A. 5:30 or so. 5:30, okay, good. All right, so this phenomenon of opportunity hoarding. Let me define opportunity hoarding. It's a word that comes from sociologist Charles Tilly. In-group sanctioned practices that have the effect of excluding out-groups. And the exclusion doesn't have to be intentional, but it happens. And you know, your very own Douglas Massey wrote this wonderful book, among many wonderful books he's written, Categorically Unequal, when he overlaid Charles Tilly's opportunity hoarding analysis with geography. And he argued that where social boundaries conform to geographic ones, right, and you see that quite a bit, particularly when you contrast New Haven with this place here, which is, I don't know the name of it, but very, very colored and not colored, low opportunity, high opportunity, and they share a border, right? Does anybody by any chance, know what this community is? Is that, huh? That's where Yale is. All right, well, but you get the point. You get the point. You have geography, he says, Douglas Massey argues, where social boundaries conform with geographic ones, the processes of social stratification that come naturally to human beings become much more efficient. And he said in Categorically Unequal, if out-group members are spatially segregated from in-group members, then the latter are put in a good position to use their social power to create institutions and practices that channel resources away from places where out-group members live. And that same power can be used to direct resources systemically toward in-group areas. A shorthand way of saying this is that place locks in advantages and disadvantages that are reinforced over time. Geographic separation of the affluent and the highly educated in their own neighborhoods and their own jurisdictions puts them in direct competition with lower opportunity places for finite public and private resources, and the affluent jurisdictions are winning. Anybody who just gets in the car and drives in America knows this. There's dramatic differences in terms of not just school quality, but all kinds of amenities. And in my book, I feature this struggle. I mean, I'll admit it, I'll cop to it. I'm a one percenter, and I married a black one percenter. You know, somehow I managed to find this guy at age 41. Thank God. Thank you very much. And we have money, we have resources, we have influence, we can deal with the racial, the steering that goes on in discriminated markets. We can transcend this. We could afford to live anywhere we wanted to in metropolitan Washington. And I talk about this struggle for us of, you know, where to live. And I describe, we live in this wonderful integrated neighborhood, Shepherd Park in DC, that's chock full of other black professional parents who like being around other black people. And the dilemma we have is, do we move west of the park? The farther you go west in DC, the whiter it gets and the higher the educational opportunities. Do we make this social sacrifice of moving west of the park to some neighborhoods where there are no black people to be seen for our sons to get access to these wonderful resource schools? And I talk about going to these open houses. I said to my husband, you know, you've got playground envy, you know, this is within Washington, D.C., right? Dramatic differences between what our neighborhood school, the Shepherd neighborhood school has, versus what schools west of the park had. Shocking differences. And no one consciously says, hey, our public policy should be to give affluent neighborhoods and schools more and better resources, but that's what happens as a result of a concentration of motivated parents who know how to advocate for what they want. You know, all the west of the park schools, I don't know why, but they all got their capital improvements first, you know. And empirical research shows that affluent suburbs disproportionately benefit from state investments that, hi, Doug, thank you for coming. I cited your work already. They benefit disproportionately from all of the kinds of infrastructure developments that fuel growth. But beyond this kind of opportunity hoarding, the rising geographic separation of the affluent also appears to contribute to rising inequality. A nationwide study by economists at Harvard and Berkeley found that upward mobility for poor children varied greatly across the U.S. depending on where they lived. Those that were fortunate to live in cities like Seattle, Salt Lake, and Boston that had a sizable middle class and enabled poor families to live among them had a much higher rate of mobility than poor children living in segregated cities like Atlanta or Charlotte. Now, you know, I want to point to this one little outlier. West Hartford is a rare area in Connecticut and in the United States where you have very, very high opportunity, but a fair amount of non-white people living evenly dispersed among them. And in Q&A, I could talk about how that happened. It wasn't an accident. You know, there's a lot of civic engagement in places with higher mobility where, frankly, white people who are open to diversity and like it, you know, pursue policies that like fair share affordable housing and invest in schools and want to be part of the public square. The study I just cited linking segregation to rising inequality is consistent with research that shows that America has much more of a class system than other developed countries. And this is conjecture on my part, but I think place may be playing a role in this. In the same 30-year period where we got a dramatic rise in income inequality, in this country. You know, the ratio of CEO to worker pay increased 875% since 1978. The same period that we're growing income inequality, we have dramatic increases of economic segregation. And I think, this is conjecture on my part, that when you have super affluent people living in enclaves of their own where they have no exposure whatsoever to poor people or working class people, it makes it easier, I believe, to make class distinctions because they're not familiar with folks who struggle. And so it may be easier to justify allocating ever larger pieces of the economic pie to themselves, to resisting raising the minimum wage to $15. It may be easier to justify predatory lending or, you know, currency manipulations, these things that really ruin people's lives who live elsewhere. Again, it's conjecture on my part, but I am waiting for the day when a CEO says, you know, I make enough. I'm gonna, you know, raise the lowest rungs of employees. I'm gonna raise their salary and not take a raise. You know, I mean, I'm waiting for that to come from the leadership class, right? And this is a segue into my points about affirmative action. Having a leadership class that is truly diverse in origins matters not just for social mobility, but also for social cohesion. And I believe elite higher education has an ethical role to play in creating a fairer, more cohesive society, to be engines of mobility rather than reifiers of existing stratification. Now, I'll speak briefly about how place plays out and opportunity reporting plays out in college admissions now. And I understand Carolyn Hoxby was here not long ago. Somebody told me she gave a presentation recently.
It was really for faculty.
Okay, all right. Well, all right. Well, so economist Carolyn Hoxby, a sister at Stanford, a black woman at Stanford, and Christopher Avery have gotten a lot of headlines for their research. When they looked at the pool of disadvantaged or low-income, high-achieving students, and their definition of high-achieving was students that had a GPA of A minus or higher and that broke the 90th percentile on the SAT. And this cohort is much larger than you might imagine. Every year, 25 to 35,000 low-income students meet that standard. A minus GPA and 90 percentile or better in the SAT. And 6% of this cohort is black, 8% is Latino, and again, this is low income. And that translates, you know, each year there's several thousand, I can't remember the exact, number, but there's several thousand black and Latino low-income kids out there who meet standards to get into places like Princeton. But if you're at a school that only buys, for example, the mailing list for students who took the SAT, you would miss every high-achieving student who took only the ACT. Now, I'm from Alabama. In the South and the Midwest, for whatever reason, the ACT is dominant. You would miss more than half of the high-achieving students from Alabama, high-achieving low-income students from Alabama and from Michigan, if you just buy the SAT. Geographic bias continues with outreach. As I could think about the pink map. I guess I'll go back and see how deft I am at going back to this map. Let's see. I don't know why this makes me so nervous, but it does. Okay. I said there was only 17 counties in the entire country where more than half of the population is college educated. Well, the most efficient thing, those counties are the places that elite schools flock to. Princeton could fill its entering class. How many people are in the entering class in Princeton undergrad? 300? 1,300, okay. But they could fill their class only with people who come from these college-dense counties. And this is what Carolyn Hoxby and Chris Avery accused them of doing, of doing what they call lamp post recruiting. Going to the same feeder schools in the same feeder counties every year, and often going to the same elite independent schools or elite suburban high schools and looking for their Black and Latino students there. And then saying, we can't find anybody, there's a pool problem. If there's less of a pool problem than people imagine, but elite schools have to do things differently to find these people. And it just so happens that for whatever reason, disproportionately, the Midwest and the South educate low-income people better, I gather, than other parts of the area, parts of the country. But elite schools tend to recruit heavily here. Only 3.5% of the cohort I talked about is in New England. Most, 21% of them are in the heartland. Place also plays out in guidance counseling. If you're the valedictorian at a low or median opportunity high school, you get worse college counseling and worse advice than the average student in your high school. Because college counselors, they're overworked, and they tend to counsel toward the middle. And so there's this mismatch where high-achieving kids who would be perfectly qualified to enter places like Princeton often even don't know that they are, and are affirmatively discouraged. My high school counselor did it to me. I told her I wanted to go to Princeton, and she sighed like, oh, this kid is dreaming, right? Often they're affirmatively discouraged from seeking out the best opportunities at schools that actually could afford to give them a scholarship. Okay, so what does all this have to do with affirmative action? I'll go to the really hard stuff now. What I argue has been missing from the discussion and debate about affirmative action is a recognition of the definitive role of segregation. I'll go back to the other slide because it really makes my point more, and then I'll leave it on that slide. I'll zoom it in a little bit more so you can see it again a little better. Again, the green dots are non-white people, 500 non-white people for each green dot. Race-based affirmative action, as practiced at highly selective higher education, I argue, is a poor substitute and possibly a deterrent to dismantling the opportunity hoarding that now pervades elite college admissions. Race is no longer a definitive marker for who is disadvantaged in American society. And as I said, race-based affirmative action primarily benefits the most advantaged, least segregated applicants of color, and these are all students who will do fine and get into a very good college, even an elite one, if they choose to work very hard and take the most challenging classes available to them. They are going to go to college. They are in the game. But college-bound students from medium and low opportunity environments, particularly African Americans who disproportionately attend segregated schools, must be superhuman to overcome the structural disadvantages of place. And among those disadvantages, which I've already alluded to, are under-resourced schools with less experienced teachers and counselors, fewer high-achieving peers that raise expectations and share knowledge about the college admissions process. And so what I'm arguing for in this book, I think I'm arguing for something more radical and more unifying than traditional race-based affirmative action. I'm arguing that the lessons of decades of race-based affirmative actions should now be applied to the entire admissions process. And the first thing I'm arguing is that I think the admissions process should be scrubbed of any practice that reinforces advantage that's not truly tied to merit. And what do I mean by merit? I mean the ability to do college-level work and contribute to the mission of the university. And in most university mission statements say something about wanting to advance human knowledge in a way that contributes to society. I actually went and looked to read Princeton's mission statement, which was not easy to find, by the way. It's a lot easier to find other people's mission statements, but in your overview, on the landing page, when you say about Princeton, it says, Princeton seeks to achieve the highest levels of distinction in this discovery and transmission of knowledge and understanding. Then it goes on to talk about it's clearly proud of itself, as it should be about being distinctive among research universities and its commitment to undergraduate teaching. It's all nice. Later on, a little bit, 3 or 4 sentences in, it talks about providing this education in a residential community committed to diversity. And then it talks about in a way that permits the diversity. So diversity is part of its mission. It's tied to mission. But they talk about exposure to diversity in this residential community, helping people to attain skills that prepare them for positions of leadership. There you go, right? Prepare them for positions of leadership and lives of service in many fields of human endeavor, right? I hope they mean it. I hope Princeton means it, right? But there's decades of research about, ironically, affirmative action candidates with their lower test scores tend to be the candidates that come closest to meeting university mission. This comes from, Lonnie Grenier's been writing about this for a long time, and she has a book coming out soon about merit. But it's people who come from, and again, we're much more complicated. But in the old days, when affirmative action was relatively new in the 70s, places like Princeton and Yale and Harvard would get their affirmative action candidates from here. I just spoke out at Iowa, and it's so funny. The guy who runs the Multicultural Center out at the University of North Iowa went to Yale undergrad and reamed me for walking away from race. But when I gave this presentation, he said he grew up in Bridgeport, right? He grew up in Bridgeport. And so in the old days, a lot of the elites would get their black students from the inner city. I think a lot of places have given up on that idea now. But all the research says that people who come from low opportunity places have this desire to give back. And did you see in the Times today, it's been in the news the last couple of days, that richer people give less as a percentage than poor people, right? So again, it's important, I think, to really interrogate, what kind of student is really going to meet this leadership that gives back to, that's service-oriented. And I love that little phrase. I put the thing down. What's that little thing that Princeton says about itself? Right, all right, service, okay. Okay. So I argue that the admissions process should be scrubbed of practices that aren't truly tied to merit, and that they should focus on the things that truly predict college success. And in this book, I cite a study by you, Doug Massey, where you looked at indicators of college attainment or success at 28 universities across all both genders and all races. And that study found that the #1 predictor of performance, of completion, of grades, in college, in these colleges, was cumulative high school GPA, and the second strongest predictor was the willingness to forego recreation to do the work. The SAT was nowhere to be found, right? And so I argue that we should focus on these things, and that this is what affirmative action does. It takes a holistic admissions process that de-emphasizes test scores, but I'm saying that that should be done for everybody, and that the kind of bump up that's currently assigned to race in admissions should be assigned to place. My back of the envelope recommendation is that if you come from a neighborhood or a school where 20% or more of your peers are poor, by definition, you are disadvantaged. And I play out in chapter 2 of the book, Place Matters, all the systemic ways that you're disadvantaged. You could be the valedictorian of your school, the hardest working kid imaginable, but you are competing with kids who may be in these super resource schools that have 20 AP classes and you have none, right? So what I'm arguing is that affirmative action should go back to its original purpose of helping people high-achieving, hard-working people who are systemically excluded, discriminated against. And back in the 60s and 70s, race was still the dominant way in which people were excluded in this society. But today, I think place is a much more accurate marker of who is excluded from high opportunity. I also argue that standardized tests should be optional or not used at all. And there's a growing movement, a growing SAT optional movement. 10 universities just since last spring have gone SAT optional, including some places like Bryn Mawr and Temple. Barr did it 2 years ago, I think. I also argue that financial aid should return to be based 100% on need, that this so-called merit aid should be scrapped. I also argue that legacy preferences should be abolished. And for the skeptics in the room, you can look at, there are a number of schools that have stopped using racial preferences, many because they've been forced to, but some because the board just decided to stop using them. And a number of the places that have stopped considering race have also stopped considering legacies. And then finally, I argue that any organization that is sincere, any institution of higher education that is sincere about having real race and class inclusion on their campus should be partnering with an organization like Posse, the Posse Foundation, or Questbridge, that is very good at finding high-achieving students from overlooked places. Now, I am pleased to see that Princeton partners with Questbridge. Not with Posse, but Questbridge, and I applaud that. That said, I have to say, Princeton is #1 in the U.S. News and World Rankings, but only 12% of the student body at Princeton is on Pell Grants. And it's #1 in the U.S. News and World Rankings, but it's number 23 among the top 25 ranked schools in terms of socioeconomic diversity. And I think that's a shame. I don't think that's a record to be proud of for a school that's so rich. Now, you're right behind Yale, right? Yale's number 22. But Columbia, so only 12% of the people on this campus receive Pell Grants. But Columbia is ranked number 4, and 30% of the people who attend Columbia receive Pell Grants. And imagine what that would be like. Imagine what it would be like to be on a campus where almost 1 out of 3 of the students come from a family that make something like, I think the Pell Grant, you have to be really poor to get a Pell Grant. It's like this $20,000 a year or not more than $40,000 a year, right? You would be coming into contact on a daily basis with people whose lives are probably very different from yours. And that's what I mean by, these places like Princeton that are incubating the leadership class. I think it's highly important for so-called future leaders to really understand the lives of people who are poor. And this brings me to my final point. There are much larger issues at stake than who gets into Princeton or these other elite schools. Much, much larger issues at stake. If you haven't noticed, this country, and certainly the national legislature, is fairly dysfunctional, right? I mean, nothing happens in Washington anymore. I mean, we're broken in terms of our politics. And part of the reason, and this is chapter 1 of my book, part of the reason is you have, in a lot of places now, poverty is growing fastest in the suburbs, right? Poverty is growing fastest people back here, they know poverty. They know poverty for a long time, right? But poverty is growing fastest in some of these outlying places, right? Suburban communities that have been hit hard by the economic dislocations since the economic bubble, right? Places where all the middle-class jobs have been winnowed out. The factory's closed, the port is closed, good, solid middle-class jobs are gone, and you have a lot of white people experiencing poverty for the first time, a lot of them college-educated. And there's a lot of anger and resentment that's just sitting there, waiting to be stoked, and it is stoked every day, particularly by radio talk show hosts, often by politicians, although they're less race-coded than they used to be. Part of what brings me to this position, place, not race, is there increasingly for poor folks who are out here, there is a commonality of daily life and struggle to people who are here. And I'm on the board of an organization, Building One America, that is building direct alliances between urban communities and struggling older suburbs that are experiencing a dramatic increase in racial diversity and poverty at the same time and struggling with how to figure it out. And I personally prefer strategies that encourage rather than discourage cross-racial alliances. Place, in addition to being a context that contributes to opportunity hoarding, also is potentially a very powerful tool for organizing. And in the final chapter of my book, which is entitled Reconciliation, I hold up examples of multiracial alliances that included blacks, whites, Latinos, Democrats, Republicans, people who, alliances among ordinary folks that aren't in these super affluent, high opportunity places, that built a majority, that changed, that was able to win a policy battle in the state legislature, that moved it to a fairer course. I cite the example of the Texas 10% plan, but other plans, Building One New Jersey, which is an affiliate of Building One America. That coalition has protected Mount Laurel. I'm pointing to Doug and thinking about his work in chronicling the Mount Laurel fair share housing case in New Jersey. That's won a fairer distribution in New Jersey of allocation of resources for education, fairer funding formulas. And I think it's important, I say this to my friends in the civil rights community who don't like my proposal very much, to think about, where do we want to end up? In a rapidly browning country, I think it's very important to think about this. And then as I was writing this book, I constantly found myself going back to Dr. King, who was radical in his politics and always trying to bring about this beloved community. And he understood, if you look back at the Civil Rights Movement, which much of it happened in my state, dear old Alabama. This was a multiracial movement that captured the minds and hearts of people. And I think place is a better place to be, particularly because it's more apt to help people who are actually disadvantaged. And with that, I think I will conclude and take questions.
We have time for questions, so I'm happy to help you field them, but I can tell you that we'll cut off the last question about 5:45 because we have to keep moving, so you can start.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Abby McCartney. I'm a second-year MPA student here, and before I came here, I worked with low-income students in Louisiana. And one piece, obstacle that they often came up against being from a low-opportunity place was that they didn't want to go far away to college, and that was partly coming from students, and also partly coming from parents who were uncomfortable with the idea, what if something happens, you're not nearby. So when you're thinking about access to elite education and place versus other considerations, for students who live in kind of the middle of the country where there aren't a whole lot of, there are state universities that are good, and there are state universities that have very low graduation rates, and that sort of raise this question of is this really access to the same kind of education? How do we, is it a question of better outreach to those students? Is it a question of improving those institutions so that there are more opportunities closer to home? And how does place come into that?
Well, in my book, I hold up the example of Amherst for a number of reasons. I mean, I think they're nearly a quarter Pell Grants, but they recognize the outreach challenges, and they actually spend a lot of their own money to overcome some of the things you're talking about. When I applied to Princeton and Vanderbilt and didn't even step foot on either campus. It didn't, a campus visit was a luxury that I didn't even think about. But Amherst brings 350 students, low income, high achieving students, to its campus at its expense every year, in part, to get people on campus and to see it as a realistic possibility. Another thing that Amherst does that's really innovative is it takes almost all of its transfer students from community colleges, and so for a lot of kids, the community college may be, assuming it's a good one, and there's issues with quality, as you talked about, but that may be a good way to get started. You go to community college, you get A's. Amherst only takes community college students with straight A's, but that may be a way to help a student negotiate that issue, and it's true. It is very true. A lot of low-income kids feel the tug of family and obligations to family, but there is this tremendous pool, and there is this mismatch thing where a lot of students, they may have heard of Princeton, but they may not have heard of Carrollton College, or a lot of really Oberlin, a lot of really good colleges that may be closer to them than they might otherwise think about, but just don't even know it exists.
Thank you for your talk. My question has to do with what are the advantages of talking about place versus class? And the reason I raise this question is because you rightfully note that many places in the metropolitan area are in flux. Right? We're seeing middle-class, upper-middle-class suburbs, an influx of poor immigrants. We're seeing that impoverished inner cities and central cities are seeing more gentrifiers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So with these changes happening in the metropolitan area, should we be talking about class
No. I specifically make it clear why I take on place and not class. I don't think class, which is income, accurately reflects the systemic, savage disadvantages, structural disadvantages that exist in society, whereas I think place accurately reflects that. Again, I tie it to poverty rates. Now, it's a snapshot, it may be changing, but if you go to high school where, I'd be curious what Doug thinks about this. I picked 20%. It's not realistic for somebody in a 40% or higher poverty neighborhood more than likely isn't going to have a fighting chance of being competitive at an elite selective university. But the reason why class is troubling to me is because statistically, if you're white and low income, you are likely, it's not definitive, but you're likely to live in a middle class area, right? If you are black or Latino, you could be from a family making $100,000 a year, but a lot of people who are middle and even upper income, who are African American and Latino, live in medium or low opportunity settings, right? So I think place accurately reflects, particularly if you have the percentages of the people on free and reduced lunch from their school, it accurately reflects the factors that affect educational opportunity, right? And so I'm saying the people who need and deserve help in terms of affirmative action are those who've had to overcome obstacles that are directly tied to the educational opportunities we have available. And unfortunately, in this country, we distribute educational opportunity by place. So that's why. Do you follow what I'm saying? Right? Yes, sir.
Could I follow up on that? If you were to use your map and superimpose upon it income, family resources, second homes, alumni giving, how would that change your map? I mean, would it radical, or the drowning of America? How would that change the distribution of highly educated, higher incomes, higher resources? Would it change anything on your map?
Well, what were your factors? I'm sorry, tick them off again.
Well, you can begin with income, family resources, second homes, alumni giving. How would that change your map in terms of location?
If you mapped people by, well, see, income as opposed to wealth. I forgot to mention this. I also say, in addition to considering place as a bump up in admissions, low family wealth, I also argue is a factor that should be considered. But both of those are tied to the kinds of structural disadvantages I'm talking about in terms of what is the quality of opportunity you have had. And if a kid comes from low quality opportunity but has worked really, really hard and is within striking distance, give them a leg up. Income alone doesn't reflect those structural disadvantages. You may be lucky, you may be one of those lucky people, and this tends to be white people, who's low income but actually has the opportunity to get into a solid middle class school. So that's why I gravitate to those two factors. Honestly, I'm a person who reads the research of demographers, reads the research of people like Doug and others. I'm not an empiricist, I don't do it myself, so I can't tell you how the map would be different. But I chose the factors that, again, are tied to the kinds of educational opportunities that are available. And place accurately reflects that.
Let me just clarify, you can never get alumni given on a census, because that's an institution-based indicator as opposed to something at the county level that's measured with census data. only universities track those kinds of things. You had your hand up a while ago.
I'm also an MBA student here and a law student at Yale, and I think I share a lot of, just intuitively and anecdotally understand that that places certainly, or that race doesn't capture a lot of the things that you're looking for when you do affirmative action. But I wonder, do you worry in stating it as sort of place not race, that you're contributing to a sort of an idea that race doesn't matter, that it's we're post-racial, that this isn't an issue? Because I think it's absolutely true that place really does matter, and socioeconomic background is very valuable as a sort of as a thing that we want to equalize, but that race is also still so salient and still so important in disadvantaging even the most privileged, even the most successful, even those who are going to have the opportunities anyway are still not going to have the opportunities that their white peers have.
Okay, so I get this question a lot. And anybody who reads the book, not everybody does, but anybody who reads the book would see very clearly that I'm not post-racial. I'm not denying the salience of race. But in fact, what I'm arguing, it's counterintuitive, it's more complicated, but this is a trade book and you have to have a title, a catchy title. Like 90% of the goal of, 90% of the work, I'm told, of selling a trade book is the title, they agonize over title. So, we picked a title that's trying to clear through the clutter and get people to pick it up and read it, right? The subtlety is in the argument, and actually I'm arguing that place captures more accurately than skin color, than phenotype, the continuing legacy of Jim Crow in this country, right? And I'm not arguing that race doesn't matter, and I'm not even arguing that I'm not Ward Connolly, I'm not Clarence Thomas, I'm not even arguing that I don't support considering race in other contexts. If race is, if there's racial discrimination, like racial profiling in Ferguson, race is relevant to making a remedy. If there's racial discrimination in employment, race is relevant to making a remedy. And I'm not even sure, I might even, this sounds like it's counter to what I've said, I might even support race consciousness in terms of employment, particularly if I walked past the wall, and I'm glad to see you here, but I didn't see a black face on the faculty, on the pictures, maybe you had one, but I might support race consciousness if you have systemic exclusion by race. But what's troubling to me at the most elite places, like Yale, like my own school, I teach con law, and last fall when I was teaching con law, I had only 3 black students, and the number of black students had declined, but 2 of the 3 were from Nigeria. The third one, they were all women. The third one was an African American, who was the granddaughter of a very prestigious federal judge. None of them were disadvantaged. And so, I'm arguing, I think my proposal actually would help more of the type of student that people I think have in mind when they're talking about affirmative action, right? The unfinished business of the civil rights movement is how to include, let's be honest, right? Poor black people are the people that everybody fears. That map is a reaction to poor black people. I have a problem with a race-based affirmative action where my kid or somebody who lives in high opportunity and has every advantage gets to claim the legacy of apartheid, and meanwhile it enables Princeton or other places to keep their SAT rankings and take no risks and do nothing to dismantle the systemic disadvantages in this society. So I decided to be brave and follow the courage of my kids. I know there are risks, but meanwhile, it's a dying policy. The Supreme Court has said if a majority of the population of the state wants to ban it, they can. And 6 states are already mobilizing to do that. And so, I think it's going to die a slow slow death as it is. And so part of me stepping into that space and offering, I think, an affirmative action policy or process, a phalanx of reforms that would survive a lawsuit, and that could exist as long as segregation exists. The argument for it will be there. Dylan, not passionate. You do?
Okay, so, one just quick question. Do you think that race-based social policy is something that we need to see more of in this country, to address some of these inequalities that are really stratified by place? Because I think even if you look at high schools in these sort of low opportunity areas, a lot of kids that live there aren't even at high school, because those schools don't have the resources to sort of capture the kids that have dropped out, so who aren't going to school. And so sort of as part of this, sort of capturing more students and, getting a better representation of students in elite institutions, does that need to be accompanied by sort of greater emphasis on place-based social policy?
Well, yes. I mean, like I said, there are much larger issues at stake than who gets into elite schools. And part of what my long-term agenda is, or aspiration, is to be part of a movement that, creates a saner multiracial politics that will invest more in K-12 education and widen the pipeline and give more opportunity to people who aren't going to be going to Princeton. Yeah, place-based strategies in a lot of contexts make sense, particularly when you have increasingly people of all colors who are locked out, who are in low opportunity places. So yes, short answer is yes. Christy, do we get one more? Brittany?
I'm interested in the topic from the perspective of college admissions officers. In your conversations with administrators at places like Amherst, to what extent do admissions officers explicitly focus on aspects of place disadvantage versus class or other disadvantage?
Well, I looked at quite a few affirmative action policies and researching this book, and aside from there are about four states, I think, that have these percent plans. Most well-known is the Texas 10% plan. And I strongly support those plans. I don't think they're the only thing that should happen. But beyond the places that have, for those who don't know, 10%, the 10% plan is where if you graduate in the top 10% of your high school, you automatically have access to a place somewhere in the public university system.
Of your choice.
Of your choice. Which is radical compared to what existed before. But about 4 states have those kinds of plans. Very few, very few have other conscious kind of place strategies like what I've suggested. Now, quite a few of them in states where they've had bans imposed on them are doing a lot more to try to expand the pipeline. And I think Michigan, which has a race ban, has added zip code as a consideration. But it's not something that's widely considered. And again, the thrust of my book is to try to get, and it's sort of intentionally a polemic, is to try to get people to acknowledge this, to acknowledge that there's segregation. And there's all this hand-wringing about an achievement gap between Black and Latino kids and whites and Asians, but they never acknowledge that there are these savage inequalities that contribute to the achievement gap. So that's what I'm trying to get people to do.
We'll have one more question. Is that on the side?
That's a little bit of a follow-up to the last question. I'd be curious, you were talking about Princeton's mission statement. At one point you said, I hope they really believe that. And obviously Princeton does. But, take somewhere else like Yale or Harvard. I'd be curious the extent to which you actually think that's what they're trying to achieve. And they're just...
Okay, when you say, what's the it that you're talking about? Because there was actually, 2 or 3 values embodied in all the stuff that I read. There was prestige. Princeton wants to be the best in the world, the best academic institution in the world. There's prestige. And then there's undergraduate teaching. And then there was lip service paid to diversity. And what I said was, I hope they mean it.
I guess my question is, do you think that, in terms of all the suggestions that you recommend, do you think that the big reason these haven't been implemented is because schools don't really want the results that you want, or because they're still working on finding the right mechanism and the right policies?
I'll tell you, it's easier to beat up on a school that I'm not on the board, I'm not an alum, I don't teach here, I have no, what are you gonna do? Just not invite me back, right? My instinct from people that I know that are on the Princeton board, and just from reading the statement, is that what Princeton really values is being number one. And there's history. You can read The Chosen, which is a history about affirmative action policies, in which Princeton played this game of playing around with merit aid and playing around with early admissions because they so prized beating Yale and Harvard. That seemed to be what was most important to them. Princeton is in a position to take a lot more risk. Princeton is rich. Princeton has an international brand. Do you really think it would matter whether Princeton was number 1 or number 4 in terms of its, no, but here you have Yale and Princeton ranked, they're ranked in the number 1 and 2 or whatever. This year I think they're number 1 and 2. They're number 22 and number 23 in terms of diversity, God forbid they should take a few risks with their median SAT scores to get some more poor kids on this campus. So that's why I said I hope they believe it. I'm skeptical. I know we could go on